I've found someone better. Taking half of everything, including your grandmother's inheritance. Don't bother calling. I've already moved in with Jessica. The lawyers will contact you about the divorce proceedings." I read the handwritten note 3 times before the words fully sank in. My hands trembled as I stood in our empty kitchen in Charlotte, North Carolina, the silence echoing where our voices used to fill the space with laughter and plans for the future. My name is Martha Thompson, and I'm 37 years old. Until this morning, I thought I was living the perfect life as the owner of Bright Hollow Labs, a successful pharmaceutical research company that I'd built from the ground up over the past 12 years. My husband Trevor had always been my biggest supporter, or so I believed. We'd been married for 8 years, and I'd trusted him completely with every aspect of our life together, including our finances and my most precious inheritance from my grandmother. Standing in our ransacked house, I could see exactly what Trevor had taken and what he'd left behind. Our joint bank accounts were emptied, the safe in his office stood wide open, and even my grandmother's antique jewelry box was gone from our bedroom dresser. He'd been methodical, calculating, and ruthless in his theft. The man who used to bring me coffee in bed every Sunday morning had transformed into someone I didn't recognize, someone who could steal from me and walk away without a second thought. But as I walked through each room, cataloging the missing items and the shattered remnants of our marriage, something strange happened. Instead of breaking down into tears or collapsing with despair, I felt a cold smile spreading across my face. Trevor thought he knew everything about my finances, about my grandmother's inheritance, about the empire I'd built. He'd spent months, maybe even years, planning this betrayal, positioning himself as the devoted husband while secretly preparing to take half of everything I'd worked so hard to achieve. What Trevor didn't know was that my grandmother had been far more clever than anyone in our family had ever realized. What he didn't know was that I'd been just as careful and strategic as he had been, but for entirely different reasons. What he didn't know was that the inheritance he thought he was entitled to was nothing compared to what was really waiting for me. I walked to my home office, stepping over scattered papers that Trevor had clearly rifled through in his haste. In the corner stood my personal safe, untouched, undisturbed, exactly as I'd left it. Trevor had never known the combination, and I'd never felt the need to share it with him. Now I understood why my instincts had always told me to keep some things private. As I turned the dial and heard the familiar click of the lock opening, I knew that Trevor's celebration was about to be very short-lived. The story of my grandmother Eleanor began long before I was born, but her influence shaped every decision I'd made in my adult life. She was a woman ahead of her time, a brilliant chemist who'd started her own laboratory in the 1960s, when most people believed women belonged in kitchens, not research facilities. By the time I was old enough to understand her work, she'd already built Velmark Automation into one of the most respected pharmaceutical companies in the Southeast, though she'd always kept the details of her business ventures private from the rest of our family. My parents had never understood grandmother's relationship with money or her fierce independence. They'd grown up expecting traditional gender roles and couldn't comprehend why she refused to slow down or retire, even in her 80s. When she passed away 3 years ago, the family gathered for the reading of her will with mixed emotions, grief for losing our matriarch, but also curiosity about what she'd left behind. The lawyer read a straightforward document that divided her modest estate among her children and grandchildren, with the largest portion coming to me. Her house, some jewelry, and what appeared to be about $200,000 in various accounts. Trevor had been thrilled about the inheritance, immediately suggesting we use the money to expand Bright Hollow Labs or invest in real estate. He'd always been interested in my grandmother's legacy, asking detailed questions about her business and her financial decisions. At the time, I'd thought his curiosity was sweet, a sign that he wanted to understand and honor my family's history. Now I realized he'd been calculating, measuring, and planning even then. What my family didn't know, what Trevor had never suspected, was that my grandmother had taken me aside 6 months before her death for a private conversation that changed everything. We'd been sitting in her garden, watching the sunset paint the sky orange and pink, when she'd handed me a sealed envelope and told me not to open it until after her funeral. "Martha," she'd said, her eyes twinkling with the same mischief I remembered from my childhood. "There are two kinds of people in this world, those who earn what they have, and those who try to take what others have earned. I've spent my whole life watching people carefully, and I can see which kind you are." I'd kept that envelope in my personal safe for 3 years, never feeling the right moment to open it. My grandmother had specifically instructed me to wait until I truly needed what was inside, and somehow I'd always known that moment would come. Trevor's betrayal had hurt me deeply, but it had also awakened something fierce and determined within me. As I pulled the envelope from my safe, I could almost hear my grandmother's voice encouraging me to be strong, to be smart, and to never let anyone take advantage of my hard work and generous heart. The envelope felt heavier than it should have, as I broke the wax seal that my grandmother had pressed with her personal signet ring. Inside, I found 3 documents that made my breath catch in my throat. A second will, a letter addressed to me personally, and what appeared to be stock certificates for Velmark Automation. The handwriting was unmistakably my grandmother's, elegant and precise even in her final months. "My dearest Martha," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then circumstances have forced you to need the truth about our family's real inheritance. I've watched you build your company with the same determination and integrity that guided my own career, and I've also watched your husband with growing concern. Trevor has always struck me as the kind of man who measures love in dollar signs, and I fear that someday his greed might overcome his affection for you." My hands shook as I continued reading. My grandmother explained that the will read at her funeral had been a decoy, a test to see how people would react to what they believed was her entire estate. The real will, witnessed and legally binding, told a completely different story. Velmark Automation hadn't been sold when she retired, as the family had always assumed. Instead, she'd maintained controlling interest in the company through a complex web of holding companies and trust funds, and the business had continued to grow exponentially over the past 3 years. The stock certificates in my hands represented ownership of 65% of Velmark Automation, now valued at over $15 million. But that wasn't all. My grandmother had also established a trust fund that had been quietly accumulating interest for my benefit, currently worth another $8 million. The letter explained that she'd wanted to ensure I had the financial independence to make my own choices in life, free from anyone who might try to control or manipulate me through money. "I've seen too many women trapped in unhappy marriages because they believed they couldn't afford to leave," my grandmother had written. "I've also seen too many people reveal their true character when they think money is involved. If you're reading this letter, I suspect both of those situations have become relevant to your life. Remember, my dear granddaughter, that the best revenge against someone who underestimates you is to exceed every expectation they ever had." As I set the letter down and examined the legal documents more carefully, I realized the brilliant strategy my grandmother had employed. The decoy will had served multiple purposes. It had kept greedy relatives from fighting over her estate, it had prevented anyone from targeting me for my inheritance, and it had created the perfect test to reveal people's true motivations. Trevor had spent our entire marriage believing I was moderately successful but not wealthy, and his decision to leave me for my grandmother's modest inheritance proved exactly what kind of person he really was. I reached for my phone to call my lawyer, knowing that Trevor's attempt to steal half of everything was about to backfire spectacularly. He'd been so focused on grabbing what he thought belonged to me that he'd never considered the possibility that I might have resources he'd never imagined. The phone rang twice before my lawyer, Patricia Williams, answered, her voice immediately shifting from casual to professional when she heard the tension in my tone. "Martha, what's wrong? You sound shaken." "Trevor left me," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "He cleaned out our accounts and moved in with his secretary. But Patricia, that's not why I'm calling. I need you to come to my house immediately. I've discovered some documents about my grandmother's estate that change everything." Within an hour, Patricia was sitting in my kitchen, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she examined the papers I'd found in my safe. I watched her eyebrows raise higher with each page she turned, her professional composure cracking slightly as she realized the magnitude of what we were dealing with. "Martha, do you understand what this means?" she asked, setting the documents down carefully. "Your grandmother essentially created a financial fortress around you. These stock holdings alone make you one of the wealthiest women in North Carolina, and the trust fund provides enough passive income for you to live comfortably for the rest of your life without ever working again." I nodded, though the reality still felt surreal. "What I want to know is this. Can Trevor claim any of it in the divorce?" Patricia smiled grimly as she flipped through the legal documents again. "Not a penny. The trust was established before your marriage, the inheritance came from your grandmother's estate, and most importantly, Trevor never knew these assets existed. North Carolina is an equitable distribution state, which means marital property gets divided fairly. But this inheritance was never marital property to begin with. Your grandmother's lawyers were extremely thorough in protecting these assets." "There's something else," I said, pulling out my phone to show Patricia the bank statements I'd been reviewing. "Trevor thinks he emptied our accounts, but he only had access to our joint checking and savings. I've been keeping my business accounts separate, and Bright Hollow Labs has assets worth about $4 million that he never knew about. He was so focused on the inheritance he thought he deserved that he completely miscalculated how much he was actually taking." Patricia's expression shifted from professional concern to something approaching glee. "So let me understand this correctly. Trevor believes he's walked away with half of your wealth, but in reality, he's taken maybe 5% of your actual net worth?" "Exactly," I confirmed. "And there's more. I've been tracking some irregularities in his recent behavior, and I think I know why he was so confident about leaving me for Jessica." I explained how Trevor had been working as a financial advisor at Thornmere Logistics, a mid-sized investment firm downtown. Over the past 6 months, I'd noticed him taking more business trips, working longer hours, and being increasingly secretive about his clients. At the time, I'd attributed his behavior to career ambition, but now I suspected something more calculated. "I think Trevor has been planning this departure for months, maybe longer," I continued. "He's been positioning himself with Jessica, who works as his secretary. But I suspect she's also been helping him understand our finances and plan his exit strategy. What they didn't count on was that I've been just as observant as they've been secretive." Patricia leaned back in her chair, a strategic glint in her eyes. "What do you want to do about this, Martha? We could simply file for divorce, protect your assets, and let Trevor discover his mistake naturally. Or..." She paused, clearly considering other options. "Or," I prompted, "or we could be more proactive about ensuring Trevor faces consequences for his theft and deception. What he's done isn't just morally wrong, Martha. Taking money from joint accounts without your knowledge or consent could constitute fraud, especially if we can prove he was planning this betrayal while misrepresenting his intentions to you." I felt that cold smile returning to my face as I considered the possibilities. "I want to do this right," I told Patricia, my voice gaining strength with each word. "Trevor thought he could manipulate and steal from me because he assumed I was naive about finances and too trusting to protect myself. I want him to understand exactly how wrong he was, but I want it done legally and thoroughly." Patricia nodded approvingly. "Good. The first step is documenting everything. I'll need bank statements, evidence of the joint accounts he emptied, copies of any communications between you two about finances, and a detailed inventory of what he took from the house." As we worked through the afternoon, I began to see the full scope of Trevor's deception. He'd been systematically moving money from our joint accounts into his personal accounts for the past 3 months, small amounts that I'd attributed to his usual spending patterns. He'd also taken out a credit card in both our names and run up nearly $15,000 in debt. Debt that would normally become my responsibility in a divorce. "The pattern suggests premeditation," Patricia observed as we reviewed the financial records. "This wasn't a spontaneous decision to leave you for another woman. This was a calculated plan to steal as much money as possible before disappearing. "What about Jessica?" I asked. "How much trouble is she in for helping him?" "That depends on how involved she was in the actual theft," Patricia replied. "If she was just the other woman, that's morally questionable but not illegal. But if she helped him access accounts, forge signatures, or hide assets, she could be facing fraud charges alongside Trevor." I pulled out my laptop and showed Patricia something I'd discovered while reviewing my security system. "Look at this footage from 2 weeks ago," I said, playing a video that showed Trevor and Jessica entering my house together while I was at work. "They spent 3 hours here, and I can see them going through my office and our bedroom. Trevor had given her access to our home without my knowledge or permission." Patricia's expression darkened as she watched the footage. "This is breaking and entering, even if he had a key. He brought another person into your home without your consent and allowed her to go through your private belongings. Combined with the financial theft, this paints a picture of someone who's been systematically violating your trust and your rights." "I want to file criminal charges," I said firmly. "Not just for the money, but for everything. The breaking and entering, the fraud, the theft. I want Trevor to understand that actions have consequences." "Are you prepared for this to get messy?" Patricia asked. "Trevor will probably try to claim that everything he took was rightfully his as your husband. He might try to argue that you were hiding assets from him, especially once he realizes how much money you actually have. His lawyer will likely advise him to paint you as a deceptive wife who was secretly wealthy, while allowing him to believe you were struggling." I laughed, a sound that surprised us both with its bitterness. "Let him try. I have 8 years of marriage where I supported his career, encouraged his ambitions, and shared everything I thought I had with him. I have proof that I never hid my business income or my known inheritance from him. And most importantly, I have proof that the assets he's trying to claim didn't even exist in my life until after he'd already started planning his betrayal. Then let's make sure he faces the full legal consequences of his choices," Patricia said, gathering the documents. "I'll file the criminal complaint tomorrow morning, and we'll also start the divorce proceedings immediately. Given the circumstances, I think we can make a strong case for you to retain all marital assets as compensation for his theft." As Patricia left that evening, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete confidence in my own strength and judgment. The next morning brought an unexpected phone call that changed everything. I was reviewing quarterly reports for Bright Hollow Labs when my assistant Jennifer knocked on my office door, her expression uncertain. "Mr. Williams from Thornmere Logistics is on line 1, she said. "He says it's urgent and concerns your husband." I picked up the phone with growing curiosity. Robert Williams was the senior partner at Trevor's firm, and I'd met him several times at company events. His voice was strained when he spoke. "Martha, I'm calling because we have a serious situation involving Trevor, and I believe you need to know about it immediately," he began. "This morning, we discovered that Trevor has been embezzling money from client accounts. The amount we've identified so far is approximately $200,000, but we're still investigating." My blood ran cold as the implications hit me. "When did this start?" I asked. "Based on our preliminary investigation, the thefts began about 4 months ago," Robert continued. "We only discovered it because one of our major clients called yesterday asking about discrepancies in their account statements. When we started digging deeper, we found a pattern of unauthorized transfers and falsified documents. 4 months ago was exactly when Trevor had started acting more secretively and taking on additional clients." "Robert, I need to tell you something," I said, and explained about Trevor leaving me and cleaning out our accounts. "Dear God," Robert breathed. "Martha, this means Trevor has been stealing from both his clients and his wife to fund whatever scheme he's been planning. We've already contacted the police and the State Financial Regulatory Board. I'm afraid Trevor is going to be facing very serious criminal charges." After hanging up, I immediately called Patricia to share this development. The news added a completely new dimension to our legal strategy. "This is actually better for your case," Patricia explained. "If Trevor has been embezzling from clients, It proves he's been systematically dishonest about money for months. It also means that any assets he claims from your marriage might actually be stolen funds, which gives us grounds to argue that he has no right to any marital property. That afternoon, I received a call that I'd been expecting but dreading. Trevor's voice was panicked and desperate when I answered. "Martha, you have to help me," he said, without any greeting. "There's been a huge misunderstanding at work, and they're trying to blame me for some accounting errors. I need you to loan me money for a lawyer." "A loan?" I repeated, incredulous. "Trevor, you stole every penny from our joint accounts and left me a note saying you'd found someone better. Now you want me to loan you money?" "It's not what you think," he said frantically. "Jessica and it's complicated. I made some mistakes, but I never meant for any of this to happen. If you could just help me get through this legal situation, I promise I'll make everything right between us." I let silence stretch between us for a long moment before responding. "Trevor, I'm going to say this once, and I want you to listen carefully. I've filed for divorce. I've reported the theft of our joint accounts to the police. And I've hired one of the best lawyers in Charlotte to make sure you never get access to another penny of my money. You made your choice when you decided to steal from me and move in with your secretary. Now you get to live with the consequences." "You don't understand," he pleaded. "I was trying to build a future for us. Everything I did was because I thought you deserved better, and I was working to make that happen." "By embezzling money from your clients?" I asked coldly. "By bringing another woman into our home? By emptying our accounts and leaving me a note?" "Trevor, the only thing I don't understand is how I could have been married to someone for 8 years without realizing what kind of person you really are." I hung up the phone and immediately called Patricia to report the conversation. The courthouse in Charlotte was buzzing with activity when I arrived for Trevor's arraignment 3 weeks later. Patricia had arranged for me to be present as a victim in the embezzlement case, and I wanted to see Trevor face the consequences of his choices firsthand. As I walked through the marble halls, I felt a sense of closure settling over me like a warm blanket. Trevor looked haggard and desperate when they brought him into the courtroom in handcuffs. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his expensive suit was wrinkled, and his eyes darted around the room frantically until they landed on me. I met his gaze steadily, my expression calm and composed. The man who had once promised to love and cherish me now looked like a stranger, someone who had revealed his true character through his actions rather than his words. The prosecutor read the charges against Trevor: embezzlement, fraud, theft, and breach of fiduciary duty. The total amount stolen from his clients had risen to over $300,000 as the investigation continued. When the judge asked for his plea, Trevor's court-appointed lawyer entered a plea of not guilty, though his voice lacked conviction. During the brief hearing, I learned that Jessica had also been arrested as an accomplice. According to the prosecutor, she had helped Trevor access client files and had used her position as his secretary to forge documents and manipulate account records. The two people who had thought they were so clever in their deception were now facing years in prison for their crimes. As the judge set a trial date and denied Trevor's request for bail, I felt the final pieces of my old life falling away. The man I had trusted with my heart and my future was being led away in handcuffs, and I felt nothing but relief. He had chosen this path when he decided that greed was more important than love, and now he would have plenty of time to reflect on that choice from behind bars. Walking out of the courthouse, I called Patricia to share the news from the hearing. "How are you feeling?" she asked, her voice gentle with concern. "Free," I said without hesitation. "For the first time in months, I feel completely free." The divorce proceedings had moved quickly once Trevor's criminal charges became public. With his theft documented and his embezzlement proven, Patricia had successfully argued that I should retain all marital assets as restitution for his crimes. Trevor's lawyer had tried to claim that I had hidden my inheritance, but the legal documentation proved that my grandmother's trust and stock holdings had been established long before my marriage and remained legally separate from any marital property. Bright Hollow Labs had thrived during the chaos of my personal life, almost as if the company was feeding off my newfound determination and clarity. I'd thrown myself into developing new research projects, expanding our client base, and building the kind of pharmaceutical empire that my grandmother would have been proud of. The combination of my business success and my inheritance had given me the financial freedom to pursue any dream I could imagine. I'd also discovered something unexpected during this ordeal. I was much stronger than I'd ever believed. The woman who had once worried about disappointing her husband or making him feel threatened by her success had evolved into someone who knew her own worth and refused to accept anything less than she deserved. As I drove home that evening, I thought about my grandmother's letter and her advice about the best revenge being to exceed every expectation. Trevor had expected me to be broken by his betrayal, to struggle financially without his support, and to come crawling back to him when his legal troubles began. Instead, I'd emerged from his deception wealthier, stronger, and more successful than ever before. My grandmother had been right. Sometimes the people who underestimate you provide the greatest motivation to prove them wrong. Trevor's embezzlement conviction resulted in a 7-year prison sentence, while Jessica received 3 years for her role as an accomplice. The scandal destroyed both of their reputations permanently, and the stolen client funds meant that neither would ever work in financial services again. Trevor lost everything: his career, his freedom, his relationship with Jessica, and any claim to the life he'd tried to steal from me. Jessica discovered that loving a criminal came with its own consequences when her family disowned her, and her friends abandoned her during the trial. Standing in my expanded laboratory 6 months later, watching my team of researchers work on breakthrough treatments that could help millions of people, I realized that my grandmother's greatest gift hadn't been the money or the stocks. It had been teaching me to recognize my own strength and never settle for less than I deserved. Sometimes the best revenge isn't what you take away from someone. It's what you build for yourself after they're gone.